The First World War did not truly end on November 11, 1918. Though the guns fell silent and the armistice was signed, the war's consequences continued to echo across Europe and the wider world for decades. Beneath the surface of peace treaties and victory parades lay unresolved tensions, economic devastation, political radicalization, and national humiliation. World War II did not erupt suddenly in 1939. It was the final explosion of forces unleashed in 1918. To understand what really started the Second World War, one must look beyond Adolf Hitler alone and examine the fragile, broken world left behind by the First. Europe in 1918 was a continent in ruins. Entire regions had been flattened, millions of young men were dead or wounded, and empires that had existed for centuries, the German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, and Russian Empire, collapsed almost overnight. Old borders vanished, new nations appeared, and ethnic tensions simmered beneath artificial lines drawn on maps by victorious powers. The war had shattered not only infrastructure, but faith in governments, monarchies, and the idea that progress inevitably led to peace. At the heart of post-war Europe stood Germany, defeated, exhausted, and humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was intended to ensure peace, but instead it planted the seeds of resentment and revenge. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, a clause that struck deeply at national pride. Vast territories were stripped away, including Alsace-Lorraine to France and lands in the east to the newly recreated Poland. The German military was reduced to a shadow of its former strength, forbidden from having tanks, aircraft, or a substantial navy. Worst of all were the reparations, crippling financial penalties that drained the German economy and fueled widespread poverty. The German public did not view the treaty as justice, they saw it as a betrayal. Many believed their army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but stabbed in the back by politicians, socialists, and Jews at home. This myth of betrayal became a powerful narrative exploited by extremist movements. The Weimar Republic, Germany's new democratic government, was born under the shadow of defeat and immediately faced hostility from both the far left and far right. Democracy, associated with surrender and humiliation, struggled to gain legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary Germans. While Germany suffered most visibly, the rest of Europe was far from stable. The collapse of empires created power vacuums across Central and Eastern Europe. New states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary were formed, often containing diverse ethnic groups with competing national identities. Borders were drawn based on political compromise rather than cultural reality, guaranteeing future conflict. Minority populations found themselves trapped in hostile states, breeding resentment and separatist movements. In Eastern Europe, fear of communism spread rapidly. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had terrified conservative governments across the continent. The Soviet Union, born from civil war and ideological upheaval, represented both a revolutionary threat and a geopolitical wildcard. Western powers attempted to isolate it diplomatically, but its existence intensified polarization everywhere. Political life across Europe became a battlefield between radical left-wing movements inspired by communism and right-wing nationalist groups promising order, strength, and tradition. Economic instability worsened the situation. The cost of war had drained national treasuries, and many governments relied on debt and inflation to survive. Germany experienced one of the worst hyperinflation crises in history in the early 1920s. Currency became nearly worthless, savings evaporated overnight, and the middle class, once the backbone of stability, was pushed into despair. This economic trauma destroyed trust in institutions and made extremist solutions increasingly attractive. For a brief moment in the mid-1920s, it appeared that Europe might stabilize. International cooperation increased, Germany was admitted to the League of Nations, and treaties such as the Locarno Agreements promised peaceful resolution of disputes. But this fragile recovery rested on shaky foundations, especially American financial support. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, it shattered any remaining illusion of stability. Banks collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, and international trade ground to a halt. Democracies, already fragile, struggled to respond. The Depression proved to be a turning point. In Germany, millions lost their jobs, and desperation fueled support for radical parties. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party exploited economic misery, national humiliation, and fear of communism to gain mass support. They promised to restore German pride, overturn Versailles, and create a powerful nation once more. By 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, and within months, democracy was dismantled. Germany was no longer simply a defeated nation, it was becoming a militarized, ideological state driven by revenge. Elsewhere, similar forces were at work. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist dictatorship in the 1920s, glorifying violence and imperial expansion. In Japan, military leaders gained influence, arguing that territorial conquest was necessary for survival. These regimes rejected the post-World War I international order and openly challenged the idea of collective security. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, proved powerless. Lacking enforcement mechanisms and undermined by the absence of major powers like the United States, it failed to stop aggression. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League protested but did nothing. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, sanctions were weak and ineffective. Each failure sent a clear message: the international system would not defend peace. By the late 1930s, the world stood at a crossroads. Germany openly rearmed, violating Versailles. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and demanded territory from Czechoslovakia. Western powers, haunted by memories of the First World War, chose appeasement, hoping to avoid another catastrophe. But appeasement did not prevent war, it encouraged it. Each concession convinced Hitler that the democracies lacked the will to fight. World War II did not begin simply because of one man or one invasion. It began because the peace of 1918 was built on punishment instead of reconciliation, fear instead of cooperation, and hope without enforcement. The years between 1918 and 1939 were not a peaceful interlude, but a slow, grinding march toward another global catastrophe. And as Europe edged closer to the abyss, the final pieces were already falling into place. By the early 1930s, the fragile post-war world was beginning to fracture beyond repair. Economic collapse, political extremism, and unresolved grievances were no longer isolated problems, they were converging into a global crisis. Democracy, still young and untested in many countries, appeared weak in the face of mass unemployment and social unrest. Across Europe and Asia, strongmen promised certainty where parliaments offered debate, and action where diplomacy seemed paralyzed. In Germany, Adolf Hitler moved swiftly to transform political power into total control. Once appointed chancellor in 1933, he exploited fear of communism and chaos to justify emergency powers. The Reichstag fire became the pretext for crushing political opposition, silencing the press, and suspending civil liberties. Within months, Germany was no longer a democracy. It was a one-party state built on propaganda, surveillance, and terror. The Nazi regime fused nationalism with racial ideology, blaming Germany's defeat and suffering on internal enemies and external conspirators. Central to Hitler's vision was the destruction of the Treaty of Versailles. Rearmament began almost immediately, hidden at first but increasingly open as confidence grew. Factories shifted toward weapons production, unemployment fell, and many Germans saw tangible improvement in their lives. This economic recovery, fueled by militarization, created loyalty to the regime and masked the reality that Germany was preparing for war. To many citizens, Hitler appeared not as a warmonger but as a restorer of dignity. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 marked a critical turning point. German troops marched into a demilitarized zone in direct violation of Versailles, daring France and Britain to respond. They did not. French leaders hesitated without British backing, and Britain viewed the move as Germany reclaiming its own territory. The gamble paid off. Hitler later admitted that if the Allies had acted, Germany would have been forced to retreat. Instead, their inaction emboldened him and shattered the credibility of international enforcement. At the same time, Italy under Benito Mussolini pursued its own imperial ambitions. Fascism glorified war as a tool of national revival, and Mussolini sought to recreate a Roman-style empire. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was brutal and unprovoked, involving chemical weapons against poorly equipped defenders. The League of Nations condemned the aggression, but imposed weak sanctions that failed to stop it. Britain and France, fearing to alienate Italy, avoided decisive action. Once again, aggression was rewarded. Japan followed a similar path in Asia. Facing resource shortages and internal unrest, military leaders argued that expansion was necessary for survival. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria, establishing a puppet state and ignoring international condemnation. Like Germany and Italy, Japan discovered that the global system lacked the will to stop expansionist violence. The League of Nations became increasingly irrelevant, a symbol of moral authority without power. These aggressor states began to find common ground. Though differing in ideology and culture, Germany, Italy, and Japan shared a rejection of the post-World War I order. They viewed democracy as weak, international law as an obstacle, and war as a legitimate means of transformation. Gradually, informal cooperation turned into formal alliances, laying the foundation for what would become the Axis powers. Meanwhile, the Western democracies were deeply divided and psychologically scarred by the memory of the First World War. Britain and France had lost millions of men between 1914 and 1918. The idea of another continental war was horrifying. Politicians and the public alike clung to appeasement not merely as a policy but as a desperate hope that reason and compromise could prevent catastrophe. Peace, almost at any cost, seemed preferable to another generation slaughtered in trenches. Appeasement reached its peak with the crisis over Czechoslovakia in 1938. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a significant German-speaking population. He claimed it was a matter of self-determination, but his true aim was territorial expansion. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that conceding the demand could preserve peace. At the Munich conference, Czechoslovakia was forced to surrender territory without being allowed to negotiate. Chamberlain returned to London declaring, "Peace for our time." The peace did not last. Within months, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, exposing appeasement as a fatal illusion. This was no longer about German-speaking minorities or revising Versailles, it was about conquest. The realization came too late. Trust was broken, deterrence was gone, and war was no longer hypothetical. While Europe hesitated, the Soviet Union watched cautiously. Joseph Stalin distrusted both the fascist states and the Western democracies, believing each might turn against him. Attempts to form a united front against Germany faltered due to mutual suspicion. In 1939, Stalin made a shocking decision, a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Publicly, it promised peace between the two rivals. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The last diplomatic barrier to war had collapsed. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed Polish defenses with terrifying speed. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun, but its roots stretched back over 20 years. It was not a sudden storm, but the result of long-building pressure, a broken peace, economic despair, ideological extremism, and repeated failures to confront aggression. World War II was not inevitable, but it was made possible by choices, by punishments imposed without reconciliation, by warnings ignored, and by fear masquerading as diplomacy. The years between 1918 and 1939 were not a pause between wars, they were the battlefield on which the next war was prepared. And when the world finally awoke to the danger, it was already too late.